For today's session, it's entitled Economic Recovery, Has Planning a Role to Play? And as I've said, we have three excellent speakers, which I will introduce to everybody shortly. We have an hour for today's session, and we have to stick to that hour really quite rigidly. So I will prompt the speakers when it comes towards time for them to finish up their presentation. Throughout the session today, I would encourage you all to submit questions. You can see a sort of a box, I think it's at the bottom of your screens, where you can put in the questions. And I'll be sort of keeping an eye on those throughout the hour. And then at the end of the three presentations, we can get into some of the questions and hopefully have a useful discussion. Without further ado, turning to our first presentation, I am very, very pleased to welcome Gillian McCausland, who's an economist at Ulster University's Economic Policy Centre, who's published a lot of research on lots and lots of different topics, including the role of broadband infrastructure in Northern Ireland and analysing Northern Ireland's economic competitiveness. So really welcome, Gillian, and really looking forward to hearing what she has to say in today's presentation. Thank you, Gillian.
Thanks, Angus, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar. As Angus said, I'm an economist at Ulster University's Economic Policy Centre. And today I'll be chatting through how the Northern Ireland economy has been impacted by COVID, by addressing where we were before COVID, underlying issues that were at play, and how our behaviours have been impacted by COVID and how this has impacted infrastructure demand and the role that infrastructure and planning have to play in the recovery. So firstly, Northern Ireland before COVID, we were doing well economically. Our GVA had surpassed 40 billion. Our employment was at a record high, and unemployment and inactivity were at record lows. And this allowed the average worker to demand higher wages, and so the average person was taking home approximately 26,000 a year. And by some metrics, we still hadn't recovered from the last recession, but we were clearly on our way to a more prosperous future before coronavirus hit. However, it is important to remember that certain issues were at present in the economy prior to COVID. And whilst we were experiencing a great year economically, in a relative sense, ongoing issues such as productivity, low earnings, and an ageing and growing population, and a low infrastructure investment were at play, which need to be factored into the recovery. In the long run, Northern Ireland's overall competitiveness was slipping, and without action, it was due to slip even further. There are areas where Northern Ireland does perform well, such as in digital infrastructure and quality of life, but there are areas for much needed improvement in our business performance, productivity, labour supply, our physical infrastructure and skills and education. In Northern Ireland, we continue to be heavily dependent on imported energy, and this mix of fuel dependency is different to other parts of the UK. We meet 2/3 of our energy requirements through the use of petroleum products, and in the UK the average is 2/5. It is worth noting that in contrast with the south of Ireland, they have been reducing their import dependency, and in 2005 they were at 90% import dependency, and in 2017 this decreased to 67%. So in comparison with the south, our competitiveness here has been slipping. Air travel is an essential feature for tourism and FDI attractiveness, and Northern Ireland's position here again has fallen. In 2008 we were ranked in 7th place, and now we are in 11th place. And passengers here do benefit from being able to choose from a variety of airports across the island to travel from, and there's also been a shift from air transport of freight to maritime transport, so this will help to explain the reduced figures. We're also a car dependent region, and on average there's 506 cars per 1,000 people. In the UK this is 476, and in Ireland it's 478. So there's continued demand on our road infrastructure. However, as environmental concerns rise, there could be a shift in the future to show a decrease in the motorisation rate, and will demand more to support electric vehicles and public transport. So it's important that the infrastructure is in place for these. And because we are so car dependent, we do spend a lot of time here in traffic, and traffic congestion in Belfast is relatively severe in comparison with capital cities, which are much more populated than here in comparison. Congestion is currently lower because many of us are continuing to work from home, and the challenge now is how we can return to work sustainably. Part of our position in sitting in traffic here is because we have less motorways. So in Northern Ireland we have 8 kilometres of motorway per 1,000 square kilometres. In the south of Ireland they have more than doubled their amount of motorways from 6 kilometres to 13 kilometres per 1,000 square kilometres. So this does again weaken Northern Ireland's position. Positively, our digital infrastructure is doing well, and in terms of access to full fibre broadband, 45% of households here have access, and in the UK the average is just under 15%. Meanwhile, 94% of households here have access to the internet in some form, and this has greatly supported home working and learning during the pandemic. And so it's important that digital infrastructure and Northern Ireland's success in this area is maintained. So overnight, coronavirus posed a major public health challenge, and the safety and well-being of our citizens became the priority. Countries have been able to flatten the curve, and in regards to the death rate, it has significantly dropped. And this is because as doctors and scientists learn more about the disease, they know how to better treat it. However, without a lockdown, it would probably be much higher. However, cases are on the rise, and part of this is due to an increase in testing. The infection rate is now 2% compared to about 20% in March. But as there is more positive tests, we have seen the likes of local lockdowns and new measures in place in Belfast and certain postcodes that were announced last week for Northern Ireland. And we could see more of these local measures in place to ensure public safety. So the impact of COVID on the global economy, this is an unusual recession in that it has been caused by a policy pause to save lives, rather than a normal recession such as a financial market crash, end of war, or reduction in government spending. And international forecasters are all estimating a downgrade for the global economy. The International Labour Organization is predicting 400 million full-time equivalent job losses across the world, and COVID restrictions are clearly having a huge impact on the global economy. And like with the global outlooks, Northern Ireland forecasters are also estimating a significant drop in GVA, ranging from -6.7% to -12.7%. So a serious recession deeper than 2008 is expected this year, and how we tackle this recession to build back better than before is important now for decision makers. And unlike previous recessions, which took months to unfold, COVID has caused an immediate shock. And the chart here would suggest that we will be experiencing a V-shaped recovery. However, there is no consensus over this, and some do suggest it will be U-shaped, W-shaped, or potentially K-shaped, as different sectors return to work at different rates, and as well as the potential for local lockdowns. So the key here is to manage the health and economic risks in policy. Our estimates suggest that 27% of the Northern Ireland workforce are in the public or in the private sector, 22% are in the public sector, and 20% are still on furlough. Meanwhile, the other 31% of the population are either students, unemployed, or inactive for various reasons. So overall, 3/4 of our population are accessing government support, and the introduction of the furlough scheme is an economic package that has never been experienced before. With the coming to the end of the furlough scheme, it is anticipated that there will be some redundancies, and there have been redundancies announced in the likes of Bombardier, Thomson and Allstate, and this is very sad for the individuals involved as well as the wider economy. And the big risk to Northern Ireland is that individuals who are on furlough may not return to the labour market, causing long-term unemployment. So as the pandemic has impacted Northern Ireland like never before, government support for workers and businesses has caused a record high in public spending, and spending has increased nearly 8% from 24 billion to 27.5 billion, or equating to 1,800 more per person. So it's important that the additional funding is used on projects that will benefit the most in society. One positive to come out of the lockdown and our movements being limited is the environmental impacts it has had. And you can see here that there has been improved air quality. Therefore, planning of infrastructure, particularly for encouraging people to use public transport when they go back to work, is important going forward. So how our behaviours have changed and looking ahead. They do say it takes 21 days to form a new habit, and as we've been in this current position for a long time, it is likely that our behaviours won't go back to the way they were. And in regards to working from home, internet access was vital to supporting not only working but learning and socialising during the pandemic, and Northern Ireland was in a good place to support this. So going forward, it's unlikely that we will see a return to the workplace like before, and so digital infrastructure needs to be a continued priority, as well as building upon Northern Ireland's competitive position in this area. Meanwhile, demand for energy has also changed because of where we now work, and so this needs to be factored in to infrastructure plans. Google workplace mobility trends show that while some people have returned to offices and workplaces, many of us have not, and so our demands on physical infrastructure has changed. We are encouraging people to get back to work, and we should encourage them to use public transport. However, the messages of social distancing, hand washing and wearing a mask should be maintained in order for people to feel safe when availing of public transport. Shipping is another area which has been impacted by the pandemic, and again, restoring public confidence in returning to workplaces and getting businesses going again will benefit the ports and increase demand for the goods and services that these ships bring. Now, I'm sure many of us on here didn't take a holiday abroad this year, and the pandemic has caused hundreds of cancelled flights and holidays for people coming to and leaving Northern Ireland. And restoring public faith and travelling abroad safely by air will be challenging for the global economy, not just Northern Ireland. Flights did pick up ever slightly in the summer months, but many of us were put off at the thought of having to self-isolate upon our return. These flight figures here also did include flights coming into Northern Ireland, and so it's important that we are sending a positive message out in our tourism campaigns that Northern Ireland is a safe place to visit. In the upcoming months, it may also be a chance for APD to come back on the agenda. So whilst many of us didn't take a holiday abroad, many of us did holiday at home, and we can see here that domestic Airbnb bookings were increased. And this will be a huge boost for the local economy, for our tourist spots and for local businesses at this time. So going forward, where does planning and infrastructure have a role? Christine Lagarde, who is head of the IMF, said that investing in badly needed but well-designed infrastructure is an obvious area of great potential, and there's a lot of evidence internationally that better infrastructure is one of the key strands that helps to deliver better standards of living. And Keynesian economics does suggest that the answer is to increase our investments in infrastructure, and this will help to boost public confidence. So overall, a better infrastructure equals better standards of living. In the immediate term, Northern Ireland can focus on shovel-ready projects which can boost aggregate demand through increased construction activity and employment. Currently, it is cheap to borrow, and so now is the time to plan and invest in infrastructure in order for Northern Ireland to build back better. At a sectoral level, job creation is expected in manufacturing and health, and it's important for us to understand the needs within the sectors and identify infrastructure which are either at or approaching capacity, such as rail links like the Belfast Portadown link, which is nearly at 100% capacity, and as well as address the water waste disposal issues at play. So to conclude, prior to COVID, Northern Ireland was doing well economically, which positively impacts standards of living, but in an overall context, persistent issues did exist. One of them was that Northern Ireland did have an infrastructure spending deficit. This was an underlying challenge, as well as the challenges in dealing with the megatrends, such as an ageing and growing population, the fourth industrial revolution, and climate change. And when COVID hit, it did accelerate these megatrends, in particular our reliance on digital infrastructure, as well as increasing our environmental awareness. And as we have seen with last week's new measures to prevent the spread of coronavirus, we need to learn to live and work safely with this disease, as well as prepare for Brexit. And Brexit may also require additional infrastructure at ports and airports, which may require extra funding. Overall, infrastructure spending does have a role to play during this recovery, and particularly because investment may help to get people back into work, particularly in construction, manufacturing and related employment. It may also help to boost consumer confidence. Infrastructure is an essential building block, but not the only element. Along with investment, going forward it will be important that there is a new programme for government, an economic and innovation strategy, and these all need to have a long-term and future-focused strategy. And this will help to boost our overall competitiveness and our standards of living. Thank you. Now you're going to pass.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gillian. And that was really good timing. So well done. Before I introduce the next speaker, could I just remind everybody about the Q&A facility, which allows you to ask questions, and just if at the end of this session, when we've had all three presentations, we do want to do a sort of a little Q&A discussion. So if there are any questions that come to people's minds while the presenters are speaking, feel free to drop them in there, and I'll try and pick them up at the end. Okay, so moving on, I'd like to introduce John Barry, Professor of Green Political Economy and Co-Director of the Centre of Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action. We're delighted to have John here to do a presentation really about the need for a green economic recovery to the pandemic. As most people will be aware, John has done a vast amount of academic research and is now the co-chair of the Belfast Climate Commission and was a Green Party councillor from 2011 to 2018 in Ards and North Down Borough Council. So he certainly understands planning at the coalface. John, you're very welcome. Thank you.
That's great, Angus. So recovering politician as well as the various other things that I do. So listen, you're all very welcome this afternoon, and thanks for the invitation. I'd like to particularly shout out to Anne McCulloch there. I see you're on the call from my previous days as a councillor. And now for something completely different. Whereas Gillian is an economist, I am a political economist, and you'll see the reasons why. And what I'm going to present are some high-level provocative ideas, I hope, in terms of how particularly planning can really get itself behind the whole building back better issue, and that we absolutely need to stop any desire or move to return to normal, which is what I think is perhaps going to happen given the inexorable pull of that particular view. And as you'll see, the points I'll be making will be in contrast to what Gillian is saying, and that I don't believe in a growth-led recovery. I think what we need in terms of a just and green transition is a jobs first. And if a bit of growth comes from that, that's fine. I think that's part of our problem economically, but that's something that perhaps myself and Gillian can have a debate between ourselves afterwards. So for me, I think we need to, state very clearly that the pandemic was unasked, uncalled for, and it's revealed in a way, and this picture here, as of co-workers, is that the pandemic has revealed quite a lot of structural problems in our societies and our economies. I mean, I'm reminded of something my father, who was a wise peasant from County Wicklow, used to always say, when only the tide goes out, that's when you know who's naked. And the pandemic has revealed quite a lot of structural issues in terms of what we need to fix. That's what the Building Back Better idea is from. And certainly I think there are some lessons from the pandemic that we can learn. This is an image from the Californian wildfires in terms of what I see is the learning opportunities from how we've approached the pandemic as states, as statutory agencies, as citizens, as communities, which can give us some indication for what we might need in addressing the planetary emergency.
John,
so in my view,
John, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm not. We're not seeing you just on the camera. I'm just wondering, is it not turned on?
It's turned on my end, so I'm not quite sure. Can you see my slides? Maybe yes, it's enough just to have my voice.
We can see your slides, which is the most important thing. Yeah, sorry to have interrupted you there.
No problem at all. So anyway, it's probably better. As I said before, Ulster suffered enough. Um, so for me, the pandemic in a way has cancelled the future, but that's okay, because what was emerging is that normal was, in my view, ecocidal, thoroughly unsustainable, addicted, particularly in Northern Ireland, as Gillian pointed out, to an over-reliance on climate-changing carbon fuel, which we're importing, making us energy insecure. And why would we want to go back to normal? You know, and the reality is that our societies have become increasingly unequal over the last 20 or 30 years, which is something we need to fix in this idea of building back better. And there is a link between the previous major global financial crisis that we had 10 years ago, where what happened then is the governments bailed out the banks to some extent. You know, Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor's furlough scheme, and other countries has in a way bailed out the people, but will it continue? I think many people are unemployed, but they just don't know it yet. Hence, to anticipate what I'll go on in a minute to talk about, we need a jobs-rich, jobs-led recovery and not necessarily be concerned about economic growth. And I do think we can learn lessons from how we've responded as states and as communities to the pandemic, as I mentioned a moment ago. So in some respects, how we've responded to the pandemic is a warm-up act. It's round one of how we need to deal with the much bigger issue of the planetary emergency. You know, particularly I'm mindful of the programme that many of us may have seen last night on the BBC, David Attenborough's programme Extinction, the Facts, a rather sobering account of how we're now living through the 6th great mass extinction event on the planet. And here's a person that I'm not usually fond or would normally quote. He's a well-known right-wing, if not neoliberal, economist and thinker, Milton Friedman. But I do think he has an important truth here, is that crises, whether in our own lives or in institutions, or certainly as we're going through now as societies, they are opportunities for real change. And so the opportunities now are, how can planning begin? And I'll talk about the campaign that the Royal Planning Town Institute has, which I think is excellent, about how we can now use this opportunity to actually do things that were once thought as crazy, once thought as outside the realm of the possible. So it's an opportunity to rethink. I think people on a more sociological level are understanding our vulnerability, whether it's long supply chains, which leaves us very vulnerable to issues of food insecurity, but also that sense that our lives cannot be taken for granted in terms of the interconnected worlds we live in. And particularly, you know, to mention an issue that's of Gillian's academic expertise, the absolute importance of broadband in rural areas at a time like this, to ensure all our citizens are connected, being able to work or to socialise online. There is, I think, a renewed interest in the importance of people seeing health, whether it's the experience of going out into the parks and green and blue spaces. And who would have thought it, that if you had a garden, you are extremely lucky during this pandemic? That, you know, one only has to think of how difficult it would be if you're a single mom in, you know, a high-rise block in London with kids having to deal with lockdown and issues. And that's an issue that we need to take forward in terms of my contribution as a non-planner to you who are planners. How can we absolutely ensure that people are within, you know, that Parisian mayor's idea of the 15-minute city, that, you know, you're within 50 minutes walk of the major amenities you need, and particularly access to green and blue spaces. And I do think there is an opening, but that window is closing fast, in my view, of building on the benefits of what we experienced in the pandemic in terms of going forward. And just a general political point, that we now realise that what you need in the context of a pandemic by way of workers is not well-paid academic professors like me. It's key workers who are often precarious, often women, in retail, in the care and healthcare system. And one would hope to think that, as well as the clapping that many of us did for our NHS workers, let's pay them decent wages, let's give them proper PPE equipment as a way of acknowledging the importance of them and the work that they do. But there is a difference between the pandemic and how we've reacted to it, and the climate and the planetary emergency. Unlike the climate crisis, we don't have very powerful organisations like the fossil fuel industry lobbying against climate action. There's nobody out there, as far as I know, lobbying for more of the pandemic. So there are limits to the the comparison one can make between them and so on. But there is lessons that we can learn, particularly in terms of, and this is a planning, it's a much more the whole of government issue. How are we going to deal with those displaced workers? Because we simply cannot continue using fossil fuels if we're to have any chance of staying within the 1.5 degree global average increase in terms of what the Paris 2015 agreement had said. So how do we have a just transition for those workers, whether in the coal, oil or gas sectors or others that are going to be affected as we move into a low carbon future? I do admire, and I've had a look at the RTPI Plan the World We Need in terms of many of the things that I think we've seen in the pandemic that have worked well: cycling, retrofitting of homes to keep people energy safe, increase their disposable income, keep them out of fuel poverty, green and blue spaces, planting trees. In fact, as an aside, planting trees is the only form of geoengineering that I support, as opposed to some of these other, in my view, scientific notions of geoengineering as a way out of the climate crisis. But, and this is where perhaps myself and Gillian and others, in fact, I would say I might be as welcome as a fart in a spacesuit for saying this, but we need to absolutely, colleagues, start thinking seriously about moving beyond orthodox GDP or GVA, and to see that there are other objectives, almost like a dashboard of objectives that we in the public policy, the academic system, need to start looking at. I mean, it's like driving a car. You don't drive a car by simply looking at the speedometer. Well, perhaps if you're a boy racer, you do. But any sensible driver is looking at, the tire pressure, looking at the engine coolant, the heating. So we do need a dashboard of indicators in terms of how to manage a modern complex society, and not to be only judging how we manage our economy simply on one measure, which is GDP or GVA, and particularly in terms of economic growth. So here's my suggestion, shameless plug, a piece I've written this year for that, the edited volume there, the Routledge Companion to Environmental Planning, and you can see what it says there. I'm asking planners in particular to consider a post-growth as part of a post-carbon economy. What's the role of planning in that? It's you can download it there on the link. And a provocative question I was asked: why this continuing clinging, almost like an article of faith, to orthodox GDP? I was always under the impression, again, as a non-planner, that what planning was about was development. And development is not synonymous with growth. And maybe that's a discussion in terms of using this opportunity in the pandemic and the planetary crisis to rethink the training of planners in terms of it, enhancing their vision, that it's not just growth, but actually it's a much wider, public duty almost in terms of the common good around development that planning needs to attend to. And again, to reiterate my point now, we are heading into a recession, if not a depression. We need jobs, not growth. And the reason why I say that is there is empirical evidence that you can have a phenomenon called jobless growth. Just look at down south in terms of one of the most open and globalized economies, open particularly to corporations who are sluicing their profits through transfer pricing through Dublin, causing increases in growth in the Irish economy, not one screed of jobs coming out of it. So I think we do really need to start dethroning that idea that growth at all costs is the major objective, either of public policy planning or certainly the planning system as a whole. And then just as another idea, that we need to start bringing people more on board, because the changes that we're looking at in decarbonising, creating a regenerative economy, are of a scale we've never seen before, and we have about a decade in which to do most of the heavy lifting. So we're going to need to bring our communities, our stakeholders, and beyond simply business and policymakers, but ordinary people need to be part of this conversation. And one way in which we could use this, and many of us are very familiar now, or at least getting more familiar, is the UN SDGs, maybe one way into seeing, again, spreading out our vision simply beyond GDP. That if we want to have that fullest version of what sustainable development is, which has social, economic and environmental, why are we prioritizing the economy? And it's interesting that this image I found on the web, guess what's on top? The economy. And I think that's the problem, is that this should be seen more as an egalitarian spread between social, economic and environmental, in which the economy cannot function unless we have social cohesion and equality, and indeed a habitable ecosystem. So let's begin to to round up. I think there is lots of support, and you know, from the highest levels. You know, Gillian mentioned Christine Lagarde. You've also got Fatih Birol from the IEA. You've also got, you know, the UN General Secretary, all arguing the idea that we need to use this pandemic as a way of greening and building back better. Or if you're interested in some of my own thoughts on that, I've just put up something else I've written. You can tell I've had a lot of time during lockdown, probably too much to be writing on these things. And there is an issue that we can see that there's an opportunity here based on, I think, some of the lessons that we can learn. And just to finish, this is my last slide. We can see that despite 20, 30 years of a fairly neoliberal, anti-public sector, anti-state ideology, that somehow the private sector was the best, we can now see states move quickly. It's the state that comes in and saves you in a disaster or a pandemic, not the free market, and they can move you know, quickly. There is a magic money tree, despite what Theresa May said, that the finance can be found in order to the state to furlough workers, to invest in PPE, and I won't have time to go into it today. This can all be funded not through debt and taxes, but actually through public money, because the UK is lucky that as a sovereign currency issuer, it can issue money to pay for this. So there's no need for austerity to be the consequence of what the government has done in terms of furloughing workers, although that's my guess at what this Tory government is going to do. But you can invite me back on and I'll talk to you all about modern monetary theory and how austerity is an ideological choice as opposed to an economic necessity. We have found that populations can adapt very quickly, social distancing, washing our hands, wearing masks and so on. And we can see that there is also social innovation. I mean, you know, we're often, you know, viewing innovation purely in terms of technological or commercial sense, but we've seen social innovation. I now know my neighbours more through a new app that I downloaded called Nextdoor and so on. And so in a way, we need to give more space and time for the encouragement of social innovation as well as technological and commercial. Yes, and we've seen, despite, you know, the great toilet roll famine that we've seen at the start of the pandemic, when it wouldn't be my first thing I'd go and grab off the supermarket shelves, by and large, people have behaved responsibly in a sense of solidarity, which is something that we need to absolutely capture and build on. And I do think that in terms of, you know, flattening the curve and so on, there was a really good communication response now, despite what the executive has done more recently in terms of what I think is a very confused response in terms of what we need to do. There was a way in which complex issues of epidemiology, of flattening the curve so that the NHS wouldn't be overwhelmed, that was done very well. Well, what about adapting that in terms of bending the curve down? And the curve down here is greenhouse gas emissions. Can we find a way of communicating that to citizens as we build back better in terms of addressing our climate crisis? And we've seen that science and expert knowledge can be listened to and guide governments. Yeah, despite certain world leaders urging us to drink bleach and so on, that actually science has been to the forefront here in terms of leading government responses. And suddenly, ideas of furloughing workers, of universal basic income, as has been introduced in Spain, ideas that were once thought beyond the pale are now not only possible, but actually seen necessary for, you know, keep societies going. And we've seen, as Gillian pointed out, there have been some positive climate impacts, but the reality is there's got to be some economic impacts. As I mentioned before, there are a lot of people in our communities that are now unemployed who just don't know it. That's why we need a jobs-rich recovery. So I would finish and say, what's the role of planning in helping us learn the lessons of the pandemic in terms of addressing our planetary emergency? So I leave it there.
Thank you very much for that really interesting, stimulating and challenging presentation. Really good. And also, I think we're more or less maybe just slightly behind time. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on now to Roisin Wilmot, who is a fellow of the RTPI and has worked in planning and regeneration for nearly 30 years. She's director of the Wales and Northern Ireland RTPI, and she's also has been awarded the OBE for services to planning in Wales. So, Roisin, over to you, and you've got a plug in John's speech there about Plan the World We Need, or the RTPI's Plan the World We Need.
Yeah, I did indeed. Thank you, Angus, and thank you, John, for leading us there on the plug for Plan the World We Need. So to recover from COVID-19, we need to make plans which accelerate progress to a zero carbon economy. We've been talking about a lot about that this afternoon. We need to increase resilience to risk as well and create fair, healthy and prosperous communities. I think we'd all agree with that. So as the governments across the UK look beyond the immediate challenges of the pandemic and towards the economic recovery measures, we've set out what the RTPI believes we must have in planning the world we need. So there needs to be a rapid transition, as we've heard, to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions to net zero. And that's going to require an incredible amount of structural changes to the economy and new ways of living and working. The following decades, we'll also see further risks from extreme weather and the breakdown of ecological systems. And these will disproportionately affect the most vulnerable in society, who have already been the hardest hit by COVID-19. So investment is clearly needed to tackle these problems, but the economic outlook is bleak. Bank of England have forecast the pandemic will push the UK into its deepest recession in 300 years. There'll be decreased output, significant increase in unemployment, and we're creating a deficit, if you like, of about 337 billion just in one financial year. So the pandemic has also layered new challenges onto the existing problems that we've talked about, and within the built environment particularly. So this undermines our resilience to risk. Vulnerable groups, especially those living in deprived neighbourhoods, have been most affected by the virus. And COVID-19 has also changed our economic geography. Some sectors and places have experienced significant job losses, and others have benefited from the rise of home working or the potential for the new green jobs. There have been efforts to relocate road space for more walking and cycling, but that's proved challenging in places which have very much been designed for the car. And shocks to the global economy have also created new challenges for decarbonising our buildings, transport and energy networks, where progress is urgently needed. So in a fragile economy with pressing social and environmental challenges ahead, recovery packages, we feel, must be carefully designed and deployed. The RTPI has called on governments to complement capital investment with the necessary resources and tools to plan effectively for the recovery at a range of scales. We have to remember as well that the planning services across the UK and certainly in Northern Ireland have seen disproportionate cuts over the past decade, and proper resourcing is urgently needed to deliver better local plans, ones which have direct stimulus measures towards place-based solutions and which have local support and deliver multiple benefits. So what can planning do? What can planning contribute to this? Well, it can deliver affordable, high-quality housing in the right locations, regenerating deprived areas for the benefit of existing communities, and improve access to key services, amenities and infrastructure. It can enable a green industrial revolution, and that's something that John's certainly talked about this afternoon, by actively planning for the growth of sectors which deliver emission reductions, environmental gains and jobs, and help places adapt to shifting economic and labour markets. It can prioritise healthy and sustainable modes of transport by integrating temporary active travel measures into strategies which lock in behaviour change and support regeneration, and enable growth in locations which help the public transport sector to recover. And certainly it can accelerate the deployment of zero carbon infrastructure by using local and strategic planning to coordinate the delivery of energy efficiency retrofit, renewable energy smart grids and nature-based solutions to flooding and overheating, guided by policies. So what's in the planning toolbox? What can we use? So achieving the objectives will require reimagining of planning. It goes beyond purely statutory and regulatory functions. And that conflicts with the view of planning held by some, not by the RTPI, I should say, who see planning as a narrow and reactive tool for managing the negative impacts of land use change and market-led development. It also neglects both the history and the potential of the profession. Modern urban planning was, of course, conceived during Victorian times as a public health intervention and responding to the spread of disease through overcrowded slums. The UK's current planning systems were designed to help build the devastation after the devastation of World War II. And in the decades that followed, planning evolved to reflect wider objectives. So we have to think about the public parks, the open spaces, higher standards of quality and affordable housing, and protecting cultural historical assets and shaping neighbourhoods. So planning must now respond to the new challenges and opportunities, supporting the economic recovery while tackling inequality, accelerating progress towards net zero carbon, building resilience and reversing habitat and biodiversity loss. There are a wide range of tools and approaches that planners can draw upon, and those which allow direct engagement with diverse local communities, support local leadership and visioning, enable collaboration across geographical and sectoral boundaries, and provide the flexibility and adaptability needed in these very uncertain times. And this is all contained within our document, which John referenced earlier, and you can see the web reference for that here. And we've also developed a series of actions under 3 themes specifically for Northern Ireland. And firstly, we turn to place. And many people do not have private access to outdoor space, and research shows that spending just 10 minutes in a natural setting can reduce the effects of physical and mental stress. So access to public green space is vital for the mental health of our population. And the planning system needs to protect those natural assets, but also improve access to them and enjoyment of them. Urban design is very important, not just what a building looks like. Design is so much more than that. And we need to think about the space around a development, and that needs much more attention. If I give you an example of Marmalade Lane in Cambridge, which won the RTPI's 2020 Jubilee Cup, is a very good example. And I'll put a challenge out there for Northern Ireland to take the lead and deliver similar high quality housing schemes. The number of people in housing stress is also likely to increase. And let's remember that building regulations changed in response to tuberculosis and cholera research. There was much more emphasis on access to light and fresh air, and waste pipes were buried underground. There has been a decoupling of health policy and planning as vaccines have allowed this. But in the absence of medicine, which we're experiencing at the moment, we return to physical measures such as social distancing. So it just shows how our physical environment is fundamental to our health. And the evidence base for LDPs gives us an opportunity for making that link again for both physical and mental health policy. So we also secondly looked at connections. We need to ensure that the high uptake in active travel, which occurred during the lockdown, continues, and people don't just return to a car dependency. There's significant health and well-being benefits, as well as positive climate impacts of that shift to active travel. And public transport capacity has been reduced in the short to medium term to enable social distancing. And there may also be a natural reduction in public transport demand as people worry about infection transmission. So that they look for working from home or shopping online and finding alternative modes of transport. But we do need to return to safe, affordable and convenient public transport, which is key to encouraging people to use public transport instead of the car. And that will bring us environmental benefits as well. And we've heard mention from both Gillian and John today about broadband. And whilst we might be leading in Northern Ireland compared to the rest of the UK, we still need more investment in broadband. 45% still isn't up nearer the 100%. So digital connectivity is very important, and perhaps we can use it more to reduce overseas travel or long distance commute, and thereby reduce carbon emissions in that sense. And finally, governance. Contingency planning needs attention in Northern Ireland, and we need much more resilient systems, IT infrastructure, and the ability for planners to work from home seamlessly during major incidents such as the pandemic. And digitised planning systems, they can also offer more efficient processes, enabling planners to focus on placemaking and facilitate wider access and increased participation in the planning process. And it's very good to hear about the Department for Infrastructure's recent contract let to improve on this work as well. So we look forward to that. It is essential that planners and planning departments have the resources they need to deliver quality outcomes for the recovery and to deliver long-term goals. We've seen an increase in public support and understanding for positive changes to place and connections, such as active travel, especially at the local scale, but we need to ensure that these things are delivered. A well-resourced, plan-led, positive planning service can deliver corporate objectives, which if effectively organised can achieve local and regional sustainable development and climate action goals. And the RTPI believes that making the role of a Chief Planning Officer a more prominent and strategic position within councils would positively influence the outcomes of planning and support good growth and a balanced recovery. So just finally, wanted to emphasise that there is this growing and diverse international movement calling on governments around the world to build back better after COVID-19. And the RTPI supports these voices and is campaigning for a recovery that creates a more sustainable, resilient and inclusive society. And we know that any failure to act now will simply defer costs to future generations and the most vulnerable, with the risks of climate and ecological breakdown to a weak economy becoming rapidly unmanageable in scale and complexity. So at this pivotal moment, we would ask, we must strengthen and invest in planning, build the capacity for critical-based systems thinking, and give all parts of the country the tools they need to shape their futures. We need recovery post-COVID-19, but not growth at any cost. And planning needs to be positive, i.e. facilitate health and well-being, social equity.
Thank you, Roisin. I think we're all good. The panelists now are all going to come online and so that we can see everybody. Just need to make sure actually you can see. Can people see me? Possibly not. There we go. That maybe says you that could be a good thing, but okay. Hopefully you can see me now. That's great. Thank you so much, Roisin, and thank you to everybody for those presentations, which were really interesting. Can I ask that everybody, if you have any questions, please put those questions, write those questions down. And we've got 10 minutes now, so we have a few questions, but not a huge number. And I suppose maybe by way of just making a start, if I could ask all the panel members something that's of particular interest to me. So I'm being quite selfish here. I'm looking for ideas. In terms of sort of this building back better, if you like, and the opportunity to rethink things and do things differently, the pandemic and the recovery from the pandemic has presented us. And I think that's a theme that all three of you have kind of brought out, purely from a sort of a planning policy perspective, in terms of how you would approach planning, you know, a town, an area, you know, a town centre, a city centre. What do you think would be the key things that maybe we need to change, and things we need to do a little bit differently maybe than we've done in the past. I'm going to start, probably, John, I'm going to put you in the spot there, because I think you were already beginning to think about these sort of things and some of the things you were saying, but can I ask you to deal with that one first?
Well, thank you. I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, I did mention in passing the Parisian idea, the 15-minute city, which I think has a lot worthy of further investigation. I think the issue of transport has been a major, learning from the pandemic. That would certainly be one that I would, promote. There are also other issues which planning would have maybe less a central role to play in terms of energy production. And you've heard me say this before, Angus, and it's a bit of a hobby horse of mine. I do wish we would see a much greater integration of spatial and energy planning within the planning profession. To be really starting to say that, you cannot build in the Greater Belfast area unless you're a net energy exporter, as opposed to a net energy user. So I think that energy piece needs a lot of work. And then I think waste management is a massive issue, which I know we've made some progress in Northern Ireland. We're now at about 50% diverted from landfill. That's not necessarily a planning issue, but planning can certainly help. But I do think our physical infrastructure, in terms of certainly our green and blue spaces, not just for mental health reasons, but to act as, sustainable urban drainage systems. The reality is, even if we were to stop burning all the carbon and, start sucking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, we're going to have to deal with inevitable climate breakdown. So how do we make our cities more resilient? Well, I would say start investing in job-rich, green and blue infrastructure. And I think planning can certainly play a role in that. And it is there. You can see it, the Belfast resilience strategy that's out there. Has elements of where Belfast can actually begin to see another B. Belfast, build back better. That's probably too many Bs.
Thank you, John. Gillian, would you like to add anything to that? It was quite a comprehensive list, I think, and quite challenging.
Yeah, I agree with John. I'd say the number one thing Northern Ireland really needs to focus on is the water, and our water infrastructure. NI Water would tell you they're at a crisis point, and water waste disposal, it really needs to be addressed. And we can't keep building on top and expect the current water infrastructure to keep going. It needs support.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Roisin, have you anything to add?
I'd just add about the importance of community engagement and bringing communities along as well. So there's in Northern Ireland, there's the statutory link between the community plan and the local development plan, which is excellent. That leads the UK in that thinking. But perhaps more can be done with communities, and maybe smaller the scales as well. So it's below the LDP level, so below the council area, get very localised, but also get communities to understand what the implications are. We'd all love, the nice things, but how do we incorporate the other things, and how do we get communities to take that responsibility as well about everything that needs to go in to make the society work as well. And just a plug that John mentioned about the connected city in Paris. We have some presentations tomorrow afternoon, so it's not
brilliant. Thank you, Roisin, and thank you, everybody. We have another interesting question here. We've had a few questions actually about infrastructure spending, infrastructure investment, but one in particular here, which is one really for all of you. And I'm just going to read it out. If the speakers had the power to deliver one key piece of infrastructural investment in Northern Ireland to aid the recovery, what would their choice be and why? So I started with John last time. So Gillian, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, well, like I just said, water is vital, and I know Minister Mallon said earlier, no drains, no cranes. Water really needs to be addressed and get the proper funding it needs. And then climate, well, climate is just as important.
Okay, John?
Very simple. And we have the data certainly for Belfast. Our biggest carbon footprint is domestic space heating. Let's retrofit, a radical retrofit programme which will keep our people safe and warm, increase their disposable income, reduce greenhouse gases, and at the same time provide non-outsourceable jobs. Bada bing, bada boom. What more do you want? That to me would hit so many co-benefits that, you know, as many of you know, Northern Ireland has the unenviable record, perhaps in Europe, of having the highest rates of fuel poverty. You know, according to the Department for Communities, it's over 40%. I mean, that's a disgrace for a modern advanced economy. So for me, absolutely, without a doubt, a retrofit program would meet so many benefits in terms of what we're talking about here.
Thank you. Roisin?
So many benefits.
I'm assuming that you're the genie, so all three of our wishes would come. So I'd echo John and Gillian's, but then maybe looking at our biodiversity as well and really strengthening biodiversity, increasing our planting. Not
Great. Look, thank you for that, Roisin. This may be one actually for you again. It's particularly one about the planning profession. And the need, how do we kind of ensure that there's the right capacity, training and kind of knowledge and skills within the profession that can deal with some of these challenges we face now?
Yeah, that is a big area, not a big issue. There are lots of planners with a lot of skills in Northern Ireland. One thing is giving them the time to do it, so having the resource and capacity, so they're not dealing with you know, a high level of applications if they're in the development management process. So properly resourcing planning, and that comes down to prioritisation of spending, partly within local councils. I know that they're facing huge issues with loss of income and high expenditure from COVID, on top of normal pressures as well. But we really need to think about actually they can deliver for the long term. There are lots of, the RTPI puts on lots of training and courses, and of course we can work with councils or yourselves at DFI collectively to deliver training that's really needed on that as well. But now we're in the days of online learning. We will be for some time.
Okay,
there's an incredible amount.
With a couple more minutes, there's a question here. I'm going to put this one to John because of his experience in local government, and since he may be able to shed some light on this one. And it's really taking up the challenge, Roisin, which you have put out there about how do we get planning further up the agenda in our councils and local government, and recognition of chief planners at council level and the contribution that they can make, if you like, at the highest level within the council. So John, how do we overcome that challenge?
Well, I think to go back to something I said, I hope all my colleagues in the public sector, and I certainly feel myself as I'm part of the public sector, just in a different bit of it, and we should be having more of these conversations and helping each other out. I really feel strongly that universities and institutions of further and higher education should really be putting our shoulder to the wheel at this crucial moment. Is that you'd like to think that there is a sense that, you know, local government planning is absolutely crucial to this. I mean, it may be exaggerating, but as I said in my response to the question I think Anne McCulloch put there in the chat, planners need to see themselves as experts in the same way that epidemiologists and our chief medical officers across the devolved regions, they were leading the response to COVID. I think planners need to now be able to do that. And I understand completely, as somebody who was in the system as a councillor for 8 years or so, that, you know, planners are constrained by, you know, being led by the politicians and so on, many of whom this conversation, you know, may mean nothing. I mean, we have politicians, colleagues, who don't accept climate breakdown is a reality, and that's what we're dealing with. We have a minister for, environment, agriculture. I can say this, you couldn't possibly comment, who is not happy with talking about climate chaos and climate crisis. So that political issue needs to be fixed first. But I would certainly like to think, and I open an open invitation to my colleagues in the planning departments across the councils and so on, to work with us in the academy to see how can we help you as best we can, particularly, frankly, and I'll finish on this, if I've not been as provocative enough, I will be now. Planning and its devolution to local councils has been a disaster in Northern Ireland. It happened too quickly, without due diligence in terms of training local councillors how to do this. And that's the problem we're left with. I can only empathise with the pain of my colleagues in the planning sections there. That genie is out of the bottle, to use a phrase that Gillian made. So we have to deal with it as best we can. So maybe it's about educating our councillors around what planning is. And actually, no councillor should sit on a planning committee unless they've done some training. We have people who haven't a baldy clue about planning law, sitting, making serious decisions, overriding officers and so on. I feel very strongly as somebody who was on the planning committee. So I just think that there should be a statutory almost duty. Councillors should not sit on planning committees unless they have some basic training in planning. To me, that's a no-brainer.
Thanks, John. That's very clear. I'm just going to finish on a final question, Gillian. Maybe this is one that you could take. And it's about the announcement the Minister made this morning about the establishment of a panel to investigate the need for a Northern Ireland Infrastructure Commission. And the question really is, what do you think that could deliver for Northern Ireland, and how important do you think that would be for our recovery? We did have an Infrastructure Commission.
Yeah, they would need to deliver something different that we don't already have here. There is the SIB. And some people are critical of it, but needs to deliver something totally different and new, be independent of government and have the power to hold them to account to really affect change. In terms of what they could do, it hasn't really been suggested yet, but they do need to have a long-term focus to deal with complex and long-term issues. So like climate change, they can't be preparing that over 2 to 3 years. It needs to have a long-term vision for Northern Ireland.
Okay, listen, thank you. Can I just thank everybody, the panel members who I think have been excellent and delivered excellent presentations today, really thought-provoking and a really good discussion. And also the delegates as well for listening and for asking the questions. And finally, can I thank Landmark Chambers and Arab, who are the conference sponsors. And thanks everybody, and hopefully you'll all be able to kind of tune into some of the further events we're having this week. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye everybody.